Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much. And thanks everyone here for coming on a lovely sunny afternoon. So, as Peter stated, I'll be talking to you today about an organisation known as the Chief Secretary's Office. This office was the nerve centre of the British administration in Ireland from roughly the early 18th century up until the transfer of power to the Irish Free State in 1922. Now, since the 16th century, the English government in Ireland had been overseen by a viceroy or Lord Lieutenant, each of whom had a chief secretary, a personal assistant responsible for organising and implementing their policy. In the course of the 1700s, however, this role expanded to an entity. It was not just simply a chief secretary, but a chief secretary's office, a much larger organisation, overseeing most areas of central government. In many ways, the chief secretary's office, by the time we're looking at it, is an equivalent to the present-day British Home Office in terms of sort of a domestic chancellery. The Chief Secretary's Office was responsible for, amongst other things, and overseeing the administration of justice, supervising the work of local magistrates, receiving petitions, conveying orders to the Attorney General, coordinating communication between different government departments in Ireland and their corresponding numbers over in Britain. In addition to all this, the Chief Secretary himself was a highly important political figure, holding a seat in the Irish Parliament, where he was essentially the government's spokesman for policy introduced there. It's thus fair to say that whoever had the job of Chief Secretary would always have their hands full. And there is a lovely quote from the 1780s describing the Chief Secretary's office as the most troublesome office in the British Empire, comprising every department in the Church, Law, State, Army and Revenue, and both Houses of Parliament. Now, despite this sort of fairly impressive brief, the actual numbers employed by the Chief Secretary and his staff were relatively small at the time we're looking at it. By the late 18th century, perhaps less than 24 individuals. The physical location of the office, if you see, we're actually in that building just below Latouche's Bank, just that little circular bit there. Chief Secretary's office would be located just in that building across the road out there from the main entrance. That's sort of the northeast corner of the upper yard. Now, following a number of refurbishments in the 1740s, the block that it's shown depicted on here on an 1840s Ordnance Survey map had been constructed on the remnants of what was known as the Powder Tower. And this is, broadly speaking, where the Chief Secretary's office remained up until the early 20th century, although its size and layout would change over time. Now, while the role of the Chief Secretary had been gradually increasing in importance for decades in the 18th century, I'm focusing today on the period after 1770, and there is a reason for that. The 1770s mark a very distinct turning point in the history of Dublin Castle. There's a number of reasons, of course. First, I would argue, is in the 1770s, the very beginning of it, saw the recent viceroyalty of Lords George Townshend from 1769 to 72, who introduced the idea of a resident Lord Lieutenant. Previous to this, Lord Lieutenants had not been permanently resident, but had only been in Dublin for sittings of Parliament, roughly 6 months out of every 2 years. Much political power was devolved onto a very powerful group of Irish political families known as the Undertakers. They undertook the King's business in the Irish Parliament on behalf of the castle. The Townshend Viceroyalty, under the Lord Lieutenant and his Chief Secretary, Sir George Macartney, had clawed that power back, bringing back political authority directly to the management of the castle. At the same time, the 1770s sees another much more international crisis unleashed, a wider imperial crisis. The British government faced mounting unrest across its dominions, with fears of an ungovernable empire as present in America as in Ireland. Irish opposition politicians in the 1770s began to adopt the language very familiar to the American colonists of patriotism, railing against corruption, absenteeism, and the lack of Irish parliamentary independence or autonomy. The demands of the war that broke out between Great Britain and its colonists in America placed new financial and logistical pressures on British government in Ireland for both men, money, and materiel. What this meant is that the 1770s, with this crisis of the American War for Independence, sees Dublin Castle transform from a largely ceremonial court into a very interventionist form of state power. This is particularly significant for the Chief Secretary's office, because it was the office tasked with enforcing law and order, not merely just political graft and patronage. Officials in the Chief Secretary's office were tasked with replying to letters, reports, and tips from across the country about potential unrest, something that was ever more in the minds of ministers. Now, the 1770s are obviously a very important period for the American Revolution, but it doesn't end there. I would argue that the 50 years after 1770, that half a century, is an age of revolutions, not only in America, but in France. These revolutions challenged old ways of ruling, and in Ireland, they raised difficult questions about who held power and why. It fell to the Chief Secretary's office to respond to this growing sense of unrest. It, the Chief Secretary's office, was responsible for protecting British rule in Ireland, and with it, the privileged position of the Irish Protestant ascendancy. This paper looks at how that office tried to control the revolutionary threats, plural, that unfurled after 1770 in this country. How the officials gathered information, kept watch on suspicious activity, and used the tools of government to try to assert control over parts of Ireland that were seen as difficult or even dangerous to govern. Now, the title of today is Spies, Smugglers, and Rebels, as the main title, and I will start actually with that second term, smugglers. Now, why start with smuggling? Well, smuggling in the 18th century speaks to some of the key themes of the Age of Revolutions. Disputes over trade and taxes, the fear of foreign influence, especially from France, then the persistence of regions that lay beyond the easy reach of state authority. Now, smuggling is not a new phenomenon in the 1770s. It's been going on for decades. It's going on for centuries. But it's been a persistent concern of officials, but you see a new level of anxiety creep in those later decades of the 18th century. Officials knew damn well that the secluded bays of Galway, Kerry, and West Cork, amongst other places, supported a very brisk trade in illegal and untaxed goods such as tobacco, spirits, tea, and occasionally high-value textiles. The contraband finding its way inland through creeks and rivers to different markets. The Irish Revenue Commissioners, themselves a substantial organisation in correspondence with the Chief Secretary, fought a seemingly unending war against smugglers and their accomplices, relying on fairly meagre resources and only the very occasional aid of the military to prevent this illicit trade. It is telling that the number of revenue officials employed in Ireland to counteract things like smuggling and illegal distilling grew up about 50% in the decades running up to the period we're looking at, expanding from about 1,000 employees to 1,500. Now, levels of smuggling fluctuate over the century, but there seems to be a minor boom in the period of the American Revolution and the decade immediately after it, the 1780s. There's various reasons to explain this. Perhaps the dislocation of trade due to the American War meant that merchants were tempted to sort of find new profits in illegal trade. But we certainly have an official response to it. In 1788, the Lord Lieutenant commented about a recent bill working its way through the Irish Parliament that took away the privilege of the port of Londonderry to import tobacco. And the reason this privilege was being withdrawn was, quote, on account of the enormous smuggling committed by the inhabitants of that district. Only 2 years previously, an official called John Foster, a staple of Dublin Castle, had produced his own scheme to suppress smuggling, in which he proposed stationing over 2,000 soldiers across the country into parties of 20, each, quote, stationed through the mountains and at the passes over the great rivers, as it is notorious that the present trade carried on by smugglers and private distillers has debauched the morals of the people and been a principal cause of the present disorder and tumults. Now, as that quote by John Foster makes clear, when the officials were targeting smugglers, they're also concerned with other unlawful activities, like illegal distilling. Poaching is a fairly vibrant trade in 18th century Ireland. And again, the Irish elite viewed cheap spirits like poaching as corrupting the morals of the common people as they saw it. Whether it's illegally imported spirits from the continent or homegrown spirits, they're blamed for a range of issues. One of the most interesting sort of disturbances that cheap liquor is blamed for is what we refer to as agrarian redressor groups, such as the White Boys, the Right Boys, the Hearts of Steel, This is a depiction of the followers of Captain Wright in the 1780s. These are secretive rural groups who take the law into their own hands, using threats and violence to protest things like high rents, evictions, other local grievances with their landlords. Like smuggling and illegal distilling, the activities of these groups highlighted the patchy and often very inadequate nature of law enforcement in 18th century Ireland. There is no professional police force. It is reliant essentially to gentry to staff the roles of magistrates and justices of the peace, amateur policing effectively. Now that situation is not unique to Ireland, but it seems to be particularly visible there. And unsurprisingly, the Chief Secretary's office receives a steady stream of reports about such disturbances. This is one example I found in Belfast in the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, a letter from Lady Moira in 1772 to the Lord Lieutenant, describing a group known as the Hearts of Steel, who were active in Ulster in the early 1770s, mainly Protestant small farmers angry about a recent very sharp rise in rents and local taxes. Now, they used violence against landlords and tax collectors, appearing in groups at night to intimidate their opponents. This letter is striking for a couple of reasons, but the main thing that jumped out to me is actually how sympathetic a fairly well-off woman like Lady Moira was to these protests. She actually advised the Lord Lieutenant to, quote, pursue lenient measures before proceeding to extremities, because, and this is her terms, these groups should not be misinterpreted in England as rebellion, which is an interesting approach, a fairly lenient approach to such flagrant law breaking. With activities by groups like the Right Boys and the White Boys and the Ribbon Men, who will come somewhat later, it perhaps should not be surprising that many of Britain's most significant early experiments in policing in the British Isles actually occur in Ireland first. It is somewhat of a laboratory for British policing. For instance, in 1786, Dublin became the first city in the British Isles to establish a centralised police force, far ahead in advance of London. In 1787, a new Riot Act gave the Lord Lieutenant special powers to respond to civil unrest, which was only enhanced in the subsequent decade by a whole host of emergency legislation, which allowed the Chief Secretary's office to declare parts of Ireland as disturbed and bring them directly under central control from the castle. In a way that was unthinkable for the Home Office over in London, Dublin Castle had a far greater, more expansive role in everyday policing in 18th century Ireland than was the norm in Britain. And this growing emphasis on a strong and very centralized policing tradition is something I'll return to later on in the talk. Now, the connection between Irish smugglers and France, along with deeper patterns of local resistance to the law, obviously had taken on a new urgency after the war with the American colonists broke out in 1775, and especially after the French entered the conflict on the American side several years later. The story of the American War of Independence's impact on Ireland can be quickly summarized. British trade restrictions during that conflict fueled resentment for average people, which Irish opposition MPs quickly turned into a wider push for reform of Anglo-Irish constitutional relations. With troops withdrawn from Ireland to fight in America, a volunteer militia, known colloquially and simply as the Volunteers, were formed in order to defend Ireland from a potential French invasion. However, the Volunteers soon became a political force in their own right, with the result being the confluence of forces in 1782, in which Ireland achieved legislative independence. While still linked to Britain, the Irish Parliament was no longer quite so controlled by Westminster. The era colloquially known as Grattan's Parliament. Now, throughout these events, the Chief Secretary's office had kept London informed, although the castle seemed curiously unable to prevent the march of Grattan and the Patriots' demands. This was a product of a few things, namely ministerial instability. There was a very quick succession of different administrations in Whitehall in London. The Prime Minister was resigned several times in only a few years, and a similar sort of corresponding churn of Lord Lieutenants and Chief Secretaries in Dublin Castle in the same period. Moreover, it's not merely the American War that's important. It's also the influence of American ideas and examples that has a real impact on Ireland. For instance, In the years after 1782, the castle had to monitor local imitators of American colonists here in Dublin. During the summer of 1784, mobs of unemployed workers in Dublin seized the importers of British goods and tarred and feathered them in direct imitation of the dock workers of Boston. You have a depiction here, actually two depictions. One is a relatively nice print called Tarring and Feathering of the Enemies of Ireland. And the second item is actually from a popular radical newspaper called the Volunteers' Journal from April of that year, which is satirically, this is not a real publication. They're publicizing a fictional pamphlet, which is just published in Weaver's Square, a second edition, The Whole Art and Mystery of Tarring and Feathering a Traitor. Now, as if this wasn't bad enough, here in Dublin Castle, the Chief Secretary was receiving rumours, whispers, that the French were secretly planning to land and foment an uprising in Ireland that summer. There was even a rumour that the Marquis de Lafayette, hero of the American Revolution, was himself planning a trip to Donegal. Now, these are fantasies, but they're fairly powerful rumours nonetheless. And it was in response to this that the castle really begins from about the mid-1780s to build its surveillance capacities. This is really the birth of the surveillance state, I would argue, in a very meaningful way. This man on the left, John Lees, was the head of the Irish Post Office, an independent organisation from its British equivalent. And in the mid-1780s, ruthlessly opened, intercepted and copied the correspondence of opposition MPs and reformers, including Edward Newnham, James Napper Tandy, amongst others. There was actually a loophole in the framing of the Irish postal legislation that actually allowed this to happen. Suspect individuals whose movements were revealed through the post were subsequently tailed by paid informants and magistrates. And significantly, one of the men organizing this surveillance, along with Lees, was his colleague Edward Cook, a junior secretary here in the Chief Secretary's office. Now, Cook had big things in his future. He would eventually be elevated to the role of undersecretary during the 1790s when he oversaw an expansion of this surveillance network. He became somewhat notorious as a result. One later writer described Edward Cook in the following way. Cook's mind took a perfectly satanic pleasure in the arts of intrigue and the darker passions of power. In the correspondence of that strange being, we observe an intellect of keen, cold, wily energy. To prompt an informer, to instruct a spy, such were the arts which he loved and in which he was versed beyond any man who has filled his office before or since. It's a very lurid portrait of Cook. Now, the castle was certainly in need of a spy master like Edward Cook during the 1790s. Just as during the American War, the outbreak of revolution in France had raised fears of an invasion as well as domestic subversion. The birth of Irish Republican separatism in the form of the Society of United Irishmen, combined with the widespread return of Catholic demands for civil and political rights, meant that the Chief Secretary's office had their work cut out for them. Long-standing methods of surveillance, such as intercepting posts and the use of paid informants, escalated. Radical newspapers like the Northern Star, run by the United Irishmen in Belfast, were kept under very close watch. And from the outset, government was in receipt of information about the inner workings of the United Irishmen and similar groups, thanks to a series of informers. We actually have a very good sense of what the castle's intelligence operations in this period were like, thanks to the very lucky survival of a key collection of documents held by the National Archives of Ireland, although formerly held in the State Paper Office in Dublin Castle up until the 80s, known as the Rebellion Papers. This is a collection of roughly 10,000 items. It's been described as the single greatest source for the study of Ireland in the 1790s, and that isn't an exaggeration. For the most part, it's a collection that consists of letters received by Edward Cook in the Chief Secretary's office, on the other side of the yard, concerning disaffection and revolutionary conspiracy. Cook is a one-man surveillance agency, as his papers, which form the core of the Rebellion Papers collection, attest. Reports of nervous magistrates, as well as paranoid busybodies, paid informers, arrested subversives, all of these documents found their way into his personal collection. I have a few examples from the treasure trove, which is the Rebellion Papers, to share with you today, and I'll try not to go over time sharing them. The first is the business papers of the Northern Star newspaper. This was a sort of the main organ of radical sentiment in the 1790s. It was eventually suppressed in early 1797, and its papers, including its business papers, were confiscated. It's interesting, not only for its radical content, but actually as just a business history of what it was like to run a newspaper in 18th century Ireland. It is fascinating, just the challenges posed by a publisher. This notebook, showing some of its distribution networks in 1793, is particularly interesting for me because it's got a note from one former subscriber to the newspaper. Mr. Adam Percy from Moira discontinues his paper as his father-in-law won't let him read it any longer. Slightly less humorously, we have reports from informers, including some of the most notorious informers of the age, such as this man, Leonard McNally. This is an item, you can find it on the Virtual Record Treasury under our Rebellion Papers curated collection, informing Edward Cook about some of the internal debates amongst the United Irishmen from one of their own members. Now, McNally was, in addition to being a United Irishman, he was a successful barrister who had been turned by the castle at some point in the mid-1790s. Highly sought after as a defense attorney, McNally was frequently called on by his fellow United Irishmen to defend them in trials, and he would then betray their defense strategy to the castle. He would go on to sign letters to Dublin Castle, not under his own name. His pseudonym was J.W., and occasionally in his own letters he would refer to McNally himself in the third person to try and throw people if they ever happened to stumble upon his letters. He wasn't actually discovered that he had betrayed his colleagues till decades after his death. Do I have time? I have time for one more item from the Rebellion Papers. It's a good one, about sort of print culture in Dublin during the 1790s, radical print culture. This is one of the most notorious, not pamphlets, but handbills posted up on the side of lampposts, which is a very popular form of radical publication, called the Union Star. And what this did is it listed informers and police spies, sometimes on very thin evidence. It incited calls for revenge against potential informers to the castle, and obviously the castle was interested in keeping an eye on this sort of publication. I draw your attention to it for one particular name on this particular issue. Guinness, a brewer at James's Gate, an active spy. United Irishmen should be cautious in dealing with any publican who sells his drink. Which, who knows what course Irish history would take if Irish Republicans had heeded that advice. Now, unsurprisingly, Dublin Castle in these years, and I put this up on the screen, this is a drawing done by Charles Valancy, a military engineer, of a defensive plan of Dublin Castle on the eve of the 1798 rebellion, showing its potential entryways. The castle and the Chief Secretary's office in these years running up to 1798 gain a somewhat sinister reputation. One later writer described how, quote, the back stairs of the castle were worn bare by the traffic of creatures as only such a regime could bring forth, like maggots bred by putrefaction. The corrupting power of gold was used unscrupulously and unblushingly to bring about the national downfall. The Chief Secretary's office, and particularly Edward Cook's desk, became something of a miniature library and museum of radical propaganda, but also of a sort of cabinet of curiosities, confiscated pikes, insignia, flags. One person who was interrogated in the castle in these years recalls hearing the screams of peasants flogged at the triangle in view of the castle windows. Now, those reports are difficult to actually verify, but there absolutely was corporal punishment used in the interrogation of suspects in the castle. That is beyond debate. And in the lead up to the outbreak of rebellion in 1798, the castle did indeed take on a very militarized appearance. We have one diarist from these years, Charles Teeling, who recalls, quote, I was surprised at the military display which the castle of Dublin presented. In 1798, it bore more the appearance of a citadel besieged than the peaceful residence of the civil authorities. Every man was dressed in military costume. Such as the law officers as I encountered had exchanged their sable for scarlet and presented the most grotesque appearance, a perfect caricature of the military profession. Now, it should be stated, and I am conscious of time here, that the Chief Secretary's office was broadly successful in its campaign against the United Irishmen in the 1790s. By the eve of the rebellion in May of 1798, the major leading figures of that movement were in government custody or had died in their apprehension, such as Lord Edward Fitzgerald. Nonetheless, a rebellion did break out that summer. South Leinster, notably Wexford, and then East Ulster. However, it was a rebellion that was uncoordinated by a central leadership in Dublin, and that probably explains much of the subsequent course of the rebellion in 1798. Nonetheless, by the time the smoke had cleared that autumn, as many as 20,000 people were dead. It's the single greatest concentrated episode of violence in Irish history between the religious wars of the 17th century and the War of Independence in the early 20th, I would argue. Moreover, in the immediate aftermath of that conflict, the castle and the Chief Secretary's office was already being tasked with a new job: passing the Union. Now, the story of how the Union was passed through the Irish Parliament has been well told. However, there are two aspects which are sometimes overlooked, which are particularly relevant to my talk today. The first is how much the Prime Minister, William Pitt, and the British government relied not on the big names, not on the Lord Lieutenant, not even on the Chief Secretary, Lord Castlereagh, but rather on career civil servants like Edward Cook and his colleagues, people who'd been part of the furniture in a room like this for several decades, people who knew that political knowledge what the price of a vote of an Irish MP was likely to be. We actually have evidence of this. This is a note made by Edward Cook to his boss, Lord Castlereagh, outlining the different constituencies, Irish constituencies in counties Antrim, the different seats, which members sat for them, but also by whom influenced. Who could control these seats in the Irish Parliament? Who did you have to go talk to obtain a seat or to obtain the vote of the person in that seat? That sort of real, sort of nitty-gritty political arithmetic was the responsibility of the castle. Second, when it comes to the Union, I would argue that something that needs to be remembered is that no one actually knew what the Union would mean in practice, even those men who were tasked with passing it. I would argue that it's actually similar to a more recent event. It's a mischievous analogy, Brexit, which no one actually knew what they were trying to get passed or what would that mean in practice. Back in 1801, however, following the ratification of the Union, we do have that debate sort of plays out in 1801. After the Union, after the Irish Parliament has essentially been extinguished, how was Ireland to be governed? Now, there were voices, such as the then Home Secretary, Thomas Pelham, who felt that there shouldn't be a Dublin Castle. The type of bureaucracy that came with a resident Lord Lieutenant, a substantial independent administration here in Dublin, should no longer exist. Ireland should be governed like an English county, like Yorkshire, is the phrase that keeps getting used, run directly from the Home Office in London. Now, that argument did not win the day. Both in 1801 and enhanced shortly after in 1803 with Robert Emmet's subsequent failed rising, the idea that the Union was going to be a clean break with a new way of governing Ireland was quickly dismissed. Instead, the 19th century would see the acceleration and the growth of the Chief Secretary's office, and particularly its role in administering law and order as a key arm of government. Now, the first decade and a bit after the Union saw a fairly revolving door of both Lord Lieutenants and Chief Secretaries. It's 10 different Chief Secretaries within about as many years, between 1801 and 1812. It's not until 1812 that we see the Chief Secretary's office really come into its own and become, I would argue, the dominant form, or dominant agency of government in what becomes in the 19th century in Ireland. And that's with the arrival of Sir Robert Peel. Aged only 24 when he took the job as Chief Secretary, one of the longest serving Chief Secretaries in the immediate post-Union period. It's a defining period for the office and for Ireland's government more generally. Looking through the correspondence of Peel and the Chief Secretary's office papers that survived from this period, it's striking that by the 1810s, actually how similar some of the concerns the castle had were to what we saw in the 1770s. Smuggling, illegal distilling, agrarian redressor groups were still very much a core part of Irish life. Groups such as the Carders, the Ribbonmen, the Rockites, the Whitefeet, amongst others. It was Peel who oversaw in 1814 the creation of the Peace Preservation Force, a paramilitary police unit which would operate directly under the authority of the Chief Secretary's office and basically lay the groundwork for the Irish Constabulary and eventually the London Metropolitan Police. It's another innovation in policing that the Chief Secretary's office is key in overseeing. Now, Peel is aided by also a very dedicated Undersecretary, William Gregory, about whom I probably do not have enough time to tell you far more today, except that he is a very important figure in the development of the office going forward in the period after what we're discussing today. Now, to bring my talk to a conclusion, why is it bound to 1820? Now, there's a lot of different ways you can sort of slice Irish history in terms of its chronologies. And obviously the Union in 1801 is usually given either as an end point or a starting point for discussions about government. And it's an important landmark. It's not the only date you can choose, though. Some historians choose 1815, the end of the Napoleonic Wars, Waterloo. Certainly a big moment for Ireland's agricultural economy. Others have chosen 1818, Sir Robert Peel leaves. If you're an archivist, 1818 is also the beginning of a collection known as the Chief Secretary's Office Registered Papers, which are currently housed by the National Archives of Ireland, and a very substantial sort of archival survival in contrast to what came before, a lot of which was lost, sadly, in 1922. I would argue, though, that 1820 is a good end date for a couple of reasons. The death of King George III, after a long bout of illness and insanity, marks the end of a reign that had gone back to the 1760s. 1820 also saw the death of Henry Grattan, the hero of the now extinct Irish Parliament. It also marked the death of a much less well-known figure who I've talked about today, Edward Cook. Slowly, in 1820, the cast of characters who had overseen the previous decades of reform, rebellion, revolution, and the Union, that cast of characters were exiting. The 1820s and 1830s would be defined by men like Sir Robert Peel, but also men like Daniel O'Connell, whom the 1820s is that key decade of emergence. However, Dublin Castle in the age of Peel and O'Connell would have to be the subject for a very different talk than today's. Thank you.